Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today we're talking about
asymmetric knowledge problems and some of the moral implications of those. And so we've got a lot of examples lined up. This sounds rather abstract at first, but we're going to explain it in ways that help connect it to our everyday experiences in life. And I expect that most people, once we explain what an asymmetric knowledge problem is, they'll be like, oh, yeah, I face those every single day, right?
Right. And it's kind of like there's always, you're like trying to grok for a word to try to describe something. And you see it a lot of times, like, oh, there's a word that I just heard about recently. It's like the feeling of walking into a spider's web. And some wordsmith like, oh, I'm going to apply a word to this because there's no word that actually describes this well enough as like a singular term.
What did they come up with?
Oh, I unfortunately can't remember. I feel a little silly about bringing it up.
Words are failing you.
Yes. So this is asymmetric knowledge problems, otherwise known as information asymmetry, is just a traditional a type of market failure. So this originally comes from economics.
So you got to explain. You got to explain what a market failure is, I think, for our listeners.
Let me just finish the sentence. A market failure where one agent has more or better information than the other. And so market failure is, within market theory, something that prevents an equilibrium point happening between supply and demand in your supply and demand curves. And under an ideal market, and we had to call it ideal because usually
they never exist.
Yeah. But there's some generalities of like, okay, you're selling something for X amount of price, and so you say you're selling something for $10 and only 5 people will buy it. But if you lower the price to $8, all of a sudden 20 people will buy it, and then if you go down more, then you're going to the point where it costs, or you're selling it for less than what you're actually producing it, and so then there's not an incentive to make any more of it. And so the idea over here is you're trying to bring it to the lowest price that will get everyone to, or the most people wanting to buy it.
There's a classical asymmetric knowledge problem with respect to buying and selling with grain that comes up in the ancient world, and some of the different Stoics weighed in on it, and they disagreed about what was okay and what wasn't okay. It was, if you are in a city and you've got a boat and it's laden full of grain, right? So you're bringing wheat in or barley or something like that, and the city has been suffering a famine. And that right behind you coming in tomorrow are like a whole bunch of other barges all full of grain, but you are pulling in that day with the only grain that anybody knows is there except for you. Do you have to reveal that there's more grain coming? And if you do, obviously the price of your grain is going to go down. Or should you just sell it for as much as you can? And it's interesting because one of the Stoic scholarchs, Diogenes of Babylon, said, no, it's perfectly fine. You could do whatever you want with it. You have no obligation to tell anybody that there's going to be more of this product coming in, and so they don't have to pay you, premium prices. And his successor, Antipater, said, this is something bad. Diogenes should not have said this. It actually comes up in one of Cicero's books where he's recounting it. That's the only reason why we know that this exchange happened. And it seems like Antipater thought that Diogenes was actually kind of a shifty guy for suggesting that it could be okay, that the captain or the owner has no obligation to reveal that information.
Mm-hmm. It seems a little bit at odds with some of the very pro-social underpinnings of a lot of Stoic thought.
It could be. I mean, we don't know much more about the thing. I mean, maybe Diogenes would have said, well, you can make a lot of money and then you can spend it on helping people or something. We have no idea. We don't actually know that
Right.
much about Diogenes other than he was one of the representatives for Greek philosophy when they sent 3 ambassadors of philosophy to Rome. And it was an unsuccessful mission because the guy who was the representative of the academy, which at that time was skeptical, argued on one side of an issue the first day, then argued on the other side of the issue the second day. And so some of the more conservative Romans were like, look at these guys, you can't trust them on anything. And that's actually, to come back to the topic, asymmetric knowledge problems do involve questions of trust, right? And who we can get information from and who we owe information to.
Right. You said it was a failure, didn't they? Like they had a 500 talent tax levied on them, and they are not a tax but a fine levied on them. Did I not reduce that to like maybe 200 talents?
Oh, the ambassador thing. Yeah, I think that they were successful in that respect, but the Romans, at least the conservative ones, were like, no, we don't want philosophy around here, So it was unsuccessful. As you're right, they were successful in their official mission. They were unsuccessful in their more cultural mission, you could call it.
And thus starts is like another step in the long lines of the Romans throwing out philosophers.
That's right. There were a few times when not only individual philosophers got exiled, including quite a few of the Stoics, for reasons we can talk about some other time, but there were a few Roman emperors who kicked all of the philosophers out of Rome. Diocletian, I think, was one of them. And I mean, imagine if you were like one of the people practicing philosophy and teaching people, and you built up a practice in, at that time, it'd be like sort of like being in New York City or London or Paris. And then suddenly they tell you, okay, all of you get the hell out of here. You can't be around, you're destroying the culture. If you don't get out of here, we're going to, we'll do something to you. I don't know what the actual penalty was. Maybe it was death. Maybe it was just, flogging or something like that,
They were big fans of corporal punishment.
That's true. Yeah. And they did not like wait around. There wasn't like an appeals process, where maybe you do something and then you go to trial like 6 months later and, you go off to prison and then you go through all your appeals. No, it was like, pretty quickly. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind another digression, Socrates, right? Big father of philosophy in so many respects. Well, he was executed and he was condemned to death. And the only reason he wasn't like executed the next couple days was because there was some religious festival going on and they didn't want to pollute the city with executions. So he got to hang around and chat with his friends for about a month or so, Otherwise, it would have been curtains right away,
Right. And thank you for reducing the asymmetry in knowledge of some of our listeners. As we get back to asymmetric knowledge problems.
Yeah.
And so now that we've talked a little bit about some market failures and what happens with the asymmetric knowledge problem often is that the true cost of something is either inflated or the negatives of taking something are often thus tamped down in order to make it, once again, the value of the object to be greater than what it is. And so, yep, please.
Well, I was wondering, there's another kind of market failure that we talk about quite a bit in business ethics, negative externalities, where you displace costs onto somebody and then the costs aren't actually taken into account. So like pollution is a classic example. Sweatshops are another example. When you're buying what they call fast fashion, there's a good chance that there's some misery built into or baked into or woven into rather the clothing that you're purchasing. And I mean, we can say this about so many other things as well. Our cheap meat comes because of factory farming in large part, right? And if you know about what happens in factory farming, both to the animals and to the people doing the work, who are usually pretty poorly paid and working under bad conditions, and think about the environment, you might say, well, I'm either willing to pay more for meat, purchase it from an ethical butcher, or I'm gonna be vegetarian. So, I mean, do these externalities fit in with asymmetric knowledge problems?
Because a lot of the times, as we'll actually talk about a little bit later, the asymmetric knowledge problems hide or obfuscate these negative externalities.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
And so now you're not even aware that they're happening. It's like, oh yeah, it's totally fine. Like you go to the store and you buy a carton of eggs for $1 and not actually know what are all the costs, and you drive and you don't know exactly what all the costs. Yeah, you just went to the gas station. You didn't see anything, and it looks nice and shiny and clean at your local BP or something. And but it a facade does not give you all the information that you need. So, and so if you, but in away from the negative externalities, if you're just talking about like, for example, this person with the grain, and he knows that more grain is coming over, you can say like, oh yeah, like I can, there's no more grain coming, so I'm going to jack up the price, which then reduces that person like, oh, well, you need grain to eat. But then that is taking away other money that they might need for other, basic needs. Maybe they can't buy new clothes or shoes for their kids or something.
And he doesn't even need to like lie to them and say there's no more grain coming. He just has to like not say that there's that what he knows to be the case. These ships are coming in tomorrow, and the market's going to be flooded with grain. He just doesn't have to say that, and he's already taking advantage of the fact that most people believe that to be the case, right?
Or you also get this a little bit if you're like the only one that can provide something. Like even if it like stuff might be coming, you can jack up the price, even though you may be able to produce more of it and reduce it yourself, but that's just more work for you. You could even potentially make more money, but like, hey, like what's a marginal increase in money if I have to work 10 times as much?
And there's a story about another philosopher who did exactly that, and it was sort of a in your face kind of thing, right? So Thales, who gets made fun of quite a lot because he said everything was water, and how could anyone be so dumb as to think that? He was a meteorologist as well as a philosopher. He's always looking at the sky, and he walked into a ditch, and so some servant girl made fun of him. Look at the stupid philosopher. Heads in the clouds and all that. And as it turned out, he, by virtue of his meteorological observations, he was able to predict that it was going to be a really good year for olives one year. And so he went around and he got basically like options on all of the different olive presses, because olives are no good if you can't press the oil out of them. And so everybody who had this great crop then had to come to him to press their oil, and he could charge basically any price that he wanted, because he bought, as they say, buy low, sell high, right? That's exactly what this philosopher did. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because another kind of market failure is monopoly, right? Or anything that's like a monopoly when you have a cartel. So I guess asymmetric knowledge problems often lend themselves to monopolization of information or resources or whatever it is that we've got going on, right?
Correct. And it was great for Thales, but like if he was the only one, now all the olive producers now like lost their shirt that year.
Well, I think they probably, he didn't like charge them so much that they went out of business, but he could charge them like, say, double what they normally would get. They still had a great year, so they're still making money, but they're not making as much money as they would if there was a complete open market on olive presses.
Yeah, it reminds me of there was, I want to say it was either like cabbage or potatoes, where someone basically
Cornered the
bought up
market on it?
all the. Yeah, he totally cornered the market on it, and he was cutthroat in the point where he made many farms go out of business
Oh,
in that 1 year, and so his name is Mud. He made like $100 million in a day, but within that farming community, he is like the boogeyman.
yeah.
But
Yeah, let's talk about some other
yeah,
venues in which this arises.
so one of the big ones is healthcare, especially in our country, and so if you're selling healthcare on a market, then that usually requires you to have the ability to go and actually test prices between different providers.
Hmm.
But when you're in an ambulance or you're unconscious, you have zero to no chance of actually doing this.
Yeah.
The main thing is, I don't want to die. Take me to the place that will make it so I don't die. And these result in one, the hospital can basically charge whatever it wants. Obviously there are a myriad of different problems with the healthcare market. This is just one of them. So I'm not going to try to throw all the problems at this one instance of a problem.
This is a really interesting one, though, because I've seen a lot of cases coming up where a person thinks they're consenting to something at one level of cost, and it turns out it costs way more, or that their insurance is going to cover something and then it doesn't cover it, and then somebody's got to. I mean, that's where a lot of these GoFundMes that we see on social media are coming from, right?
Right, and you're creating procedures. If you are like, oh man, markets are the way to actually like solve our problems here, that these are totally disregarding the market. People get sick and hurt and are charged excessive prices for something that they can't refuse. Otherwise, the alternative is death. And so we have a incredibly large amount of medical bankruptcies happening in this country due to this, at least partly asymmetric knowledge problems within this market, which is failing constantly.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the one of the promises of like having some sort of like the Affordable Care Act, having some sort of public health option, is that, well, this is going to deal with these issues that are arising, people not being able to get, covered, and not being, essentially being the little person against the big insurance companies, right? Mm-hmm. And in order to use your insurance that you buy under the Affordable Care Act, it's very Byzantine. It's there's so many hoops that you have to jump through. You have to like make decisions at certain times each year, quite often without sufficient knowledge. And unless you actually like go through line by line and look at what's covered and what's not, from year to year they change it. And so something that you thought was going to be covered isn't. It's not quite as bad as say like a user agreement, where almost nobody reads those. Right? But it is there is definitely an asymmetry there.
Yeah, especially because a lot of like if you're looking at user agreements, these are written in legalese a lot of the time, and so unless you have a speciality in that particular type of language and the laws that govern those particular type of contracts, it is very difficult for you to have a good understanding of what you're actually agreeing to.
That's interesting. So, we often talk about like informed consent as being important, medical ethics in particular, but also like in other areas. This is a bit of a side topic. Do you think it's possible to give informed consent to the average user agreement for most things like iTunes that we use, or now it's Apple Music or some of these other things? Do you think that the average person can really give informed consent or not?
I would say if your document is like a page long, maybe.
Yeah.
But
anything
they're
beyond
usually
that, perhaps
like
not.
30 pages or something, and it's usually a small typeface, so it is a massive block of text that is, I've helped in creating these documents. It took us like weeks to do it, and how are you as a user supposed to understand this when your livelihood doesn't depend on going into these things. You just want to get your music, or you just want to get your you want to swipe right for your date next, right?
Yeah. I think too, it would be very difficult to tell what's changed. I like that some of the platforms that I deal with will actually send an email saying, here's the changes we made to the agreement, right? But usually they're at kind of like high level. They don't tell you what the real nitty gritty, particular, real granular level of changes are.
Yeah, whenever I'm negotiating a contract, I actually use a tool in computer science called diff. Oh. And so diff is used to find the individual lines of codes or individual characters of codes that have changed between two iterations of code. And
interesting.
So I use it like, here's the revisions, and we talked about we were going to talk about this revision and this place, and I go, okay, well, let's see if this is actually the thing. I put the text in one side and put the new text in the other side, and it goes, here are all the lines where there's differences, and I go and check them out. Usually they're fairly straightforward, but like it gives you that peace of mind that that nothing is going to be put in there unbeknownst to you.
It also tells you if there's some red flags that need to be raised, right? Because I guess we could talk about knowledge asymmetry on, a base level, and then we can talk about it on a higher level with things like that. When you remember that old Rumsfeld thing, that differentiation between there's, things that we know.
Known unknowns and known.
There's known unknowns and then unknown unknowns. So the unknown unknowns are the ones we really have to watch out for, right? We don't have any suspicion that something has been changed or slipped in there, unless we do the sort of procedure that you're talking about, which really would require having, something like a computer checking it, because we're going to catch it eyeballing it ourselves.
Right. Rumsfeld, got a lot of blowback from that, but
people talked as if he was stupid, but it's brilliant.
Oh yeah, it is great, but because it was an unknown. They'd never heard this thing before, and it sounded like gibberish at the very cursory look of it. Yeah. But yeah, it is incredibly useful. Actually, I've used it a lot in interviews, asking, if you were me, like, what would you ask? Or like, if I because I don't know this job or this employer as well as you do. What are the things that I should have asked in this that I haven't asked?
What sort of answers do you get out of curiosity when you do that? Do they just look at you like a blank stare, or do they have an answer at the ready, or does it like kind of bother them? Or
the last time I used it, the guy said, "That's a really good question."
Well, that's a stall.
Well, yes, but at least he wasn't immediately dismissive of it.
Yeah.
And so we were, what was I doing? It was talking to, I don't think I can actually talk about that. But it's fine. I wasn't interviewing for a position, but I was getting information from another company.
Okay.
In the relationship between my company and theirs. But he actually came up with something that was really good. But once again, can't say.
Well, now you're imposing a knowledge asymmetry upon us, right?
Yeah, and this brings us to, if we want to talk about it, NDAs. And unfortunately, I work in the tech industry, and I've signed literally hundreds of NDAs, and these are there ostensibly to protect the company. And they can do that, but they can also be used to stifle information being leaked out, and to potentially stifle blowback on the company for things that were kind of like malfeasance or maybe even illegal.
Yeah, it seems like one of the big problems with NDAs, and I think we can also associate with this the requirement to go to arbitration, which has become more and more part of people's work contracts, is that it doesn't allow us. So if we imagine an ideal marketplace, right? The general idea is that bad actors are supposed to get a bad reputation, and information about what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong is supposed to get out there. And then, if somebody has a lot of, bad reviews or black marks or whatever we want to say, people will be less trusting of them and maybe will impose a higher premium on any sort of work that they do with them. But with NDAs and arbitration, it's impossible many times to tell who's good and who's bad, right? Because everybody's got this same slate. It's similar to what happened with recommendations. Companies are very leery about saying that somebody wasn't a good employee. They'll just say, well, they worked here at this and that time. I know people who get around that by saying, I'm going to talk about the weather. Now imagine if the weather showed up late all the time. There's ways to get around that. But what this is it's providing information that people need. So if you have, so what is the site? Is it Front Door that it provides? Glassdoor, right? Yeah. So that's remedying that problem in many respects. Or you could think in like the academic world. It's not perfect, of course, but Rate My Professor. Some schools use that quite a bit. The schools don't use it. The students use it quite a bit. When I taught at Marquette, they would all tell me about, my Rate My Professor things and that they used that. Teaching at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, I asked the students if they look at that, and they're like, we don't care about that. It's all word of mouth. But still, it's information, getting out there. So an NDA or...
You get any spicy chili peppers?
I used to a long time ago. Not any time in the last couple jobs. I think the last time I had that was back when I taught at Fayetteville State University, and that's almost a decade ago. So, yeah. But yeah, it's I'm myself. I'm in favor of those sorts of things. I know a lot of professors are like, oh, these people are being mean and the scores are not reflective of my ability. But it's kind of funny when I like look at my peers' ratings and what the students have to say about them, the qualitative stuff rather than just the quantitative stuff. It's sometimes eye-opening. You're like, oh man, I didn't know that about that person, especially when you see like 4 or 5 students saying the same thing about them. You're like, they had me fooled.
Like I had a company was trying to look for us to be a contract at my current company. And they're like cold calling. I was like, hey, we're trying to drum up business. And I'm like, who are these people? And I Googled them, and one of the first things that came up was a review of employees and their experience with this company. And oh man, it was a bloodbath. They just reamed them out at every which way possible. And I'm like, if you treat your employees like this, that you ostensibly are like part of your team, how are you going to treat me as a customer?
So this is kind of something. This is a bit of a side note, right? So we're digressing a bit, but when there are these knowledge asymmetries, like a company wants to keep anybody knowing whether they're a good or bad place to work, they want to have everybody assuming that they're a good place to work. Is it really possible to control that information now in the internet age when we do have all these platforms where people can grouse about it? I mean, you could like do a takedown order or something, but it's like playing whack-a-mole, right? They could pop it up somewhere else. I mean, there are going to be exceptions to this, but does it seem to you that it's more difficult to conceal information about, being a bad agent in the marketplace?
Now it's definitely more difficult to do that. There's a lot more, sunlight that is being exposed out there, and especially because a lot of companies are, they might not even be US based, and so like, hey, I had tried to do some sort of takedown court order or something. It's like, okay, but they're in Sweden, and they're like, I don't care.
Yeah.
was a terrible accent. And
it wasn't identifiably Swedish, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But I was willing to go along with it because, you know.
But maybe back to some more examples of asymmetric knowledge problems. And, you know, I guess, Greg, what is the perception of a used car salesman?
It's generally bad. I mean, I actually know a few people who have sold used cars, and as far as I know, they were fairly decent people, but I don't know how they were on the lot, you know.
Right. So why is the perception of a used car salesman bad?
That's a good question. I mean, there's I guess it must go back to decades and decades ago when you would sell cars that were not worth the price that you were selling them for, right? And you use rhetorical techniques or things like that to get people to buy them. Or maybe you wouldn't honor commitments that are made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it. Like, you know, there's that. I remember like watching old films and like the car salesman is like out there rolling back the odometer.
Oh, right.
To make the car look like it had less miles, and like, you know, throwing some eggs in the radiator so to like plug up holes, but then that's eventually gonna wear out, and so like it runs fine for, you know, maybe a week, and then it starts all falling apart, and you know the guy's like, well, you know, you got a week to bring it back, but you didn't, so
yeah,
sucks to be you.
I mean, you see like what is that? It's a Carfax reports. Yeah. I was going to say CarMax, but I knew that was wrong. That was the place that was selling them, right?
But yeah, Carfax.
Yeah, so you can't get away with as much these days, right?
Right, and you know, this is reducing that asymmetric knowledge problem. Carfax found a market niche where people wanted to know if the used cars that they were making, are actually, you know, what they're purporting to be, and give you some information about that. And like, oh, this one actually went for a swim, or this one was in a accident and the frame is actually bent, even though you can't quite see it from the outside. And so these
so that's a remedy, right?
Right.
For
and so this is an example of a market function fixing a broken market failure.
Yeah, we can call it an equalizer, right?
Right.
Perhaps is a. So let me ask you about an example that I don't think we were planning on getting to, but you kind of brought up in a way. Like think about dating apps and dating in general. You never really know somebody until you've been out with them for quite a while, unless you know them, like, you know, because you were friends before, or you went to school together, or you've got people vouching for them. So is there always going to be like an asymmetric knowledge problem involved in people's romantic life? And I mean, is it worse because of things like dating apps? I mean, some of them I guess you could actually know a lot about the person because they ask you so many different questions, but people can always lie, I suppose, too.
Right. And even if you're like, oh yeah, that person sounds like perfect and they're not actually lying, but you could like get there and all of a sudden there's something that just like totally pushes you off. It's such a hard thing to actually quantify. Is like, yes, that person actually will be good for you. And so we're all kind of going off of like, you know, little heuristics here or there. And I guess part of the thing with these dating apps is that you're now presented with a much larger market of individuals, and now you have to figure out some way to actually weed out this information. It's like, okay, I'm only going to try to interact with this group of people, like how do you go from 1,000 to maybe 10 to choose from to actually choosing, you know, 3 to go out with? And like you've only got so much time in the day. You also have to make sure like they want to go out with you, and yeah, you could say like, well, I'm only going to talk to redheads that also dye half their hair blonde and are between 5'8" and 5'9".
You're really pricing yourself out of the market there, I think. At least here in Milwaukee, maybe in a bigger venue like Chicago or New York, you might find one, but I don't know about that.
But I guess
it could be a long distance relationship, though, right? You could expand the pool worldwide.
But yeah, as you're saying, like there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I won't date anyone under a certain height or under a certain weight, and so you see all the time there's inflation of height and also deflation of weight statistics, for men and women respectively, and is, I guess, the proof is in the pudding. Like, can you get in the door? And is it moral for you to lie in order to get in the door to actually have the interaction that is the true arbiter of if someone is a good fit for you?
That was, as you're talking about that, I was thinking about this, and I wasn't going to ask the question, but now I am. No, I've never used a dating app in my life, right? I'm happily married, and that's not something on my mind. But I can well imagine, having known a lot of people who are using them and seeing quite a few sitcoms, that there would be people where you show up and they don't look anything like their picture. Now, should that be like an automatic red flag of, well, I'm not going to get straight information out of this person because they lied about, something so basic as what they look like? And I'm not talking about like somebody who has somebody else's picture. I'm talking about somebody who like maybe has, their 12-year-old picture from back in the day, and that's what they put there, and now they're 12 years older and they look quite different. Should that, with these asymmetric knowledge problems and also with the unknown unknowns, should we worry about red flags and say, now I have to be much more skeptical. Now I have to like be alert to the fact that somebody might be trying to snow me. Like, with the used car thing, right? You walk onto a used car lot. If you don't think to yourself, there's a possibility that this person is going to try to BS me, you're probably putting yourself at a disadvantage, right? Now with people, you could also do this with job things, right? You show up to the job and they're like, well, we closed that position, but we'd like to interview you for another position. Now, if I hear something like that, I'm like, I don't know about that,
Yeah, I think it is a useful bit of things to talk about, especially, if you're doing a dating app in order to actually look for a relationship, trust is a really strong and important foundational stone. And if you're basing it off of something that is very, already being deceptive at the very beginning of the offset, then that is probably a particularly egregious red flag that you should pay close attention to.
Can we expand that more broadly and say, well, if companies are going to lie to us, then we probably should expect them to lie the next time that they're talking about something, or if they're withholding information. There was an interesting thing that happened, I think it was in the summer. Somebody here in the downtown of Milwaukee, it was a construction crew, they hit a fiber optic cable. I don't know if you remember this, but like I remember downtown that you were out. The whole downtown was out of internet for at least a day. And it got solved very quickly because when the mayor's office in City Hall doesn't have internet, somebody's going to fix something. And that was part of the blackout area. And when things like that happen, right, first your internet goes out and you're like, what's going on here? Let's try to reset the modem. And then you call up the place and they're like, did you try resetting the modem? And then, pretty soon it comes out that this is a bigger thing than we thought, because you're looking at your phone and you see like everybody in the area is like, what the hell, what's going on here? And then you like go to the app and the company and they're like, well, yes, there's indeed an outage. we're not quite sure what happened. We'll get back to you when we do. And you're like, when are you going to fix this? Well, it could be a day, it could be a week. I don't know. That they know, right? They have a pretty good idea of what's going on, most likely, but they trickle out the information bit by bit by bit. Now, if you know that they're doing that as a matter of course, then you probably are going to be skeptical of most of the things that the company is saying, right?
I guess trust but verify is a useful topic here, or a useful mode of interacting. It's like, yeah, I'm going to trust you, about as much as it needs to be. But like make sure, like cross your T's and dot your I's to make sure that what they're actually saying to you is not just BS. A healthy skepticism, especially as long as it's not like life or death things.
Verify implies that you could go to some other information source and get information, right? So,
well, I guess in your example, like the other people around you that say, "Hey, we're all down as well," is a way to at least verify when the guy you talk him up is like, "Hey, it's like, did you check your modem?" It's like, "Yes, I checked my modem, and also my neighbor's modem, and my neighbor's modem. We're all down."
Yeah. I think it was social media that we were able to find out what the straight dope, as they used to call it, right? That somebody had hit a cable and that it had to be fixed and all that, because the company wasn't putting that information out at all.
Yeah. But speaking of companies, what do companies sell but products? And there's a whole host of different companies and industries that have produced products in which they deceived and obfuscated and did put up lawsuits in order to prevent certain information being made public because it was usually a negative externality of that product. One of the biggest ones is cigarette companies who knew for a long time that these their products that they sold, the basis of their company, at least had a correlation with cancer, and as more studies became, there was an absolute causation. But they marketed them as healthy. They'd say like, "Oh, this cigarette is the one that your doctor chooses," and it. The guy be in the white lab coat and it's like, yes, Pall Malls are the most smooth, and you're like, for a healthy lung, smoke Pall Mall. I don't know if that is actually what Pall Mall said. Just riffing.
There was a cigarette though that you're right. I remember seeing the ads, and there were some that were like, this will kill bacteria in your throat. Almost like gargling with Listerine, right?
And so they lied, they marketed, and they tried to silence people that were doing the science to make this like a public health risk. And then it in the 80s? Did they get that giant
it was towards the end of the 80s. Right. You're talking about the big lawsuit,
right?
That
it's been funding the Truth campaign for the last 30 years now.
Yeah,
the anti-smoking campaigns.
That's right. I remember when that happened. I think I was in high school when all of that was going on. It was a very big thing. A lot of people were very surprised, and I was surprised that people were surprised, because it said on the packs by that time, may cause cancer, all these sorts of things. But there were, in fact, a lot of people who were like, I couldn't believe these companies would do this sort of thing. And you're like, how do you not think that?
Oh, my sweet summer child.
Yeah.
Another one here is the oil companies have known since like the 50s that their products were having a detrimental effect on the climate. Their own scientists came out with these reports, and they stifled them, made sure that they didn't see the light of day. And as we have more and more information at this point in time, it is absolutely apparent that throwing a whole bunch of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere has long-term detrimental effects on the temperature, our ability to grow crops, the acidification of the ocean, all the food that we rely upon, and they fought tooth and nail, and there's even still to this day the movement saying this is all, I don't know, a hoax or just normal variations in the carbon cycle and the Earth, and it's absolutely incorrect.
One way that you can tell that that there is like this withholding of information and spinning information going on is that just until recently, conservatives in other countries didn't have any problem believing in global climate change. They become a bit more Americanized that way. It's primarily in America where there's this, who knows about the science and all that sort of, casting doubt sort of stuff, in part because that's where most of the companies are based, and that's where they spend all the lobbying money. You can't actually spend as much money in most other countries on buying politicians as you can here in the United States. And so, yeah,
the conservatives in other countries are like, yes, this is a thing. We should be doing something about it.
Well, what's really interesting with this one, and I think we can find a way to spin this into the knowledge asymmetry. The smart money, conservative or liberal or whatever, is on global climate change. You look at the insurance companies, who nobody really thinks of as being, politically liberal or anything like that. They know that it's happening because they're already like saying, we're not sure we're going to insure these areas on the Gulf Coast anymore, or the rates are going to go way up. The Army, the Rand Corporation, all these places that think about like destabilization and global strategy, they've been sounding the alarm about climate change and the dislocations that it's going to lead to in terms of food and population movement for 10 years now. So in order to say it's not happening, you really got to go against a lot of heavy hitters, I think.
The U.S. military says the number one strategic problem in the world is climate change.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, that's their entire job, is to try to figure out like, well, what are the dangers that could potentially befall our country, and they're like, this is number one. It's like, well, maybe we should listen a little. And one of the reasons why they're doing this is they know of $13 trillion worth of oil that is yet to be pumped out of the ground, and so they've got $13 trillion reasons to try to block this.
Yeah, and they might find more too. You never know.
Oh yeah. Another classic is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which was a bit of yellow journalism bringing to light the malfeasance within the meatpacking industry at the time, and how they were selling rotten, diseased, and contaminated meat directly to your home.
Yeah, that old proverb of you don't want to see how the sausage is being made. Mm-hmm. Upton Sinclair showed you how the sausage was being made, and it grossed a lot of people out.
Yeah, and it resulted in a massive amount of reform in the industry, but like the meatpack industry was not happy at all with them, and bringing to light this selling of roadkill.
This is a really great example, though, because, and I think we can apply this to other food stuff today. Consumers really do need to know what's going into the stuff that they're putting on their table and putting into their stomachs. And there's so many cases where I suppose that the information is there, but it's hard to access, or people don't know. When they look at the ingredients, they're not sure how to make sense out of whether it's good or bad for them. So this brings up the issue of information literacy that I think we should talk about after we go through a few more examples.
Yeah, well, maybe let's talk about quickly the I guess live markets, or wet markets that you find in certain countries, and how this is a breeding ground for zoonotic diseases, and zoonotic diseases are just those diseases that move between humans and animals, and usually it's birds. That's where we get flu and SARS and a number of other things, as well as I believe COVID.
Yeah, although we share a lot of stuff with pigs too.
Right.
That's another sort of hotbed for that.
And putting together these markets where you have lots of different animals that are potentially disease carriers and stacking them on top of each other, and so their feces drops between them, which is a vector for pathogens to move between these, and that is just a breeding ground. It's like, I don't know if this is exactly, this is like a black box asymmetry, because maybe the people that are selling don't even know how bad this is, and if they are told, they might not believe it, because it's just what they've been doing for such a long time.
Yeah, and I brought up factory farming before in this. I think we can say something quite similar about factory farming here in the United States. It's not like the factory farming and the meatpacking industry, as it currently exists. It's not as if we recruit people who are particularly well educated for these sorts of things. It's primarily people who are economically vulnerable that wind up in these jobs. They're often exploited. Working conditions, safety things are often not followed, and we're kind of like just almost setting up a prime situation for outbreaks or transfers of diseases back and forth between humans and animals.
Right, and especially factory farming, there's a very liberal use of antibiotics, which create
help antibiotic resistant variations. Quite true. So where does the knowledge asymmetry come in? I mean, we could talk about knowledge asymmetry in terms of like the people who are working there not knowing how much at risk they are.
I think there's, for the owners, knowing that they're trying to maximize profits, and they're not actually looking at this negative externality, and so and we as consumers of the pork that comes out on our plates aren't told explicitly that these are used with a large amount of antibiotics and the harms that causes. And so if there is any non-exploitive buying in capitalism, this is extra bad.
Yeah. And this is just a side note, but I mean, it's become worse and worse and worse in recent decades. And it's not like it was great when we were kids, but it's way worse now, than it was. I mean, we pay an extra premium for ethically grown and harvested meat ourselves because we feel pretty strongly about this. But I think most people don't know that much about it. I think maybe we need a new Upton Sinclair or something like that for our...
Well, we could, but they outlawed taking videos at many factory farms.
True. Yeah, that's true.
So that is, companies getting the state to enforce information asymmetry.
Yeah, so there's, at any given time, there's like a lot of different forces kind of jockeying, right? There's companies want to keep control over information as much as possible. Oftentimes they'll use the state, which sometimes has a real interest in like keeping things under wraps as well. And then we've got the internet, which, it can be very helpful in that you can share information, but then quite a bit of the information can also be disinformation, right? Companies can just as easily like send a bunch of astroturfed Twitter bots to tweet about whatever line they have, or pick any other sort of scenario you want. So it's not as if we have an easy solution to this, right?
Right. Maybe talk about like a little bit of information literacy and overload, and maybe that will bring us to something.
Yeah. So let's talk about information overload. This is something I notice with my students who often are not particularly information literate, meaning they don't know where to go to get information or how to do research or stuff like that. When they do start looking for things, it's almost like the proverbial fire hose coming at them, and they don't know how to sift the relevant sources or the relevant bits of information apart from the stuff that's not particularly helpful, So, a good example of this sort of thing is going, just Googling and taking like the top 10 things that come up. Those probably are not the best information sources in most cases. They may lead you to better sources. Like Wikipedia has gotten quite a bit better over the years. There's still some areas where it's kind of.
But the sources section at the bottom is like, hey, look, I can find some primary sources.
Yeah, sometimes. I look at things where I have a competency in that, and I'm like, there's better sources that they could have put there, but this is what the editors have done, and it's better than nothing, right? So information literacy is knowing. There's a whole bunch of components to it. As a matter of fact, the Library Association, they're the ones who've done a lot of work on this sort of thing. I did a fellowship with them years and years ago, the ACRL, about information literacy and how to incorporate it in our classes, because our students, they often don't have any idea where to go to get better information. Like, what are the good sources? How do you determine what counts as a good source? How do you dig deeper and deeper and deeper? And so, I know we're getting close to running out of time. I'll just say this, that it's really important that people don't just pick the first source out there, but start, exploring around to try to find better and better information. It's like a iterative process, right?
Mm-hmm. And the more you know that you don't know.
Well, that can be a bit dismaying too. So maybe where we want to end before we get to the final thoughts is like on a note of optimism, right? We've talked so much about like what we don't know, but we are in a better position than say 20 years ago or 40 years ago, like when we had card catalogs that we'd have to go to, or like look in the Reader's Guide to figure out what newspaper or magazine we'd go to get the information. Now so much is available at our fingertips.
Yeah, and it's a fire hose. And how do you properly kind of like curate that fire hose to actually get you the best? And that's an unsolved problem at the moment. And I think the best thing we have for that is maybe people in the library sciences that's their entire job, is to try to suss out a lot of the best information.
So maybe. What we want to say is people need to go to the librarians a lot more, right?
Yeah.
They're not just to find you books. They're there for all sorts of other things.
Go give some love to your librarians. So, got some a final thought in the words of Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it.